One thing that I would love to add to the biblical narratives, especially in the Old Testament, that we don't have in the Bible is a little more tidbits, a little more little like spices of life on what life was like for the average person under the reigns of David and Hezekiah. What was it like to be a nomadic wanderer in the time of Abraham? Their lives were so different in comparison to our own today that there's all these little details about their lives that had such a profound impact on how they lived and how they saw the world. But we don't get those details very often from the Bible because that's the kind of information that was the air in which they breathed. And so they saw no point in sharing those type of cultural details. But man, I would love to know more about what they ate, how they prepared their food, what it was like when they got sick, or started a family, or made a covenant, or marched off to war. How was their experience in all of those areas like our own, and how were they profoundly different? And since I really want to know those details, I always love books that work to bridge that gap from the world of today to the world of the Bible. One of my favorite books that does that is a book called The Lives of Ordinary People in Ancient Israel by William Dever. And today I am reviewing Grounded Theology in the Hebrew Bible by Elizabeth Backfish and Cynthia Shafer-Elliott. This 2025 Baker academic release looks to explore the cultural context that brought about the ancient world of the Hebrew Bible. Now, I want to be clear, the authors of this book aren't interested in giving us really cool factoids about ancient Israel, such as what childbirth was like or how they viewed sovereignty, but they want to take that information and discuss how it formed and shaped Hebrew theology, their understandings of themselves, their world, and their God, and how it shaped Scripture. And for the most part, I really enjoyed this book. There were a couple of takeaways that for me, just those few points alone were well worth the time spent reading the entire book. And if you have a few minutes, I would like to tell you a little bit more about grounded theology in the Hebrew Bible. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books on the world of the Bible, please subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with my latest book reviews. Also, like and share this video with others to help them know about the works from Baker Academic. The most affordable way to build a large theological library today is through Logos Bible software. I want to encourage you to follow the link in the description to purchase your Logos edition of Grounded Theology in the Hebrew Bible. Or you could follow my other link in the description to subscribe to Logos and enjoy their very helpful Bible study tools for 60 days. You can get them for 2 months for free by following the link in the description below. Backfish and Shafer-Elliott, they look together at the cultural context of the Hebrews, and they look at 10 different areas of their culture. They look at the household, the makeup and the structure of the family. Covenant, how did they understand entering into a covenant with each other and with God? Land, what was the significance of the oft-mentioned promised land in the Old Testament? Holiness and purity, a fascinating look into purity culture in ancient Israel. Worship, how did they worship God? How were their experiences of worship where they had a central temple and sacrifices? How was that different from what we experience in the church? Images of God, a look into how the images of the idols ends up relating to us as people made in the image of God. Kingship and politics, a look at ancient kingship and how that influences their view of the sovereignty of God. Law and wisdom, how did they view the concept of wisdom in the ancient Near East? Warfare and peace, why is there so much warfare in the Bible when our God is the God of peace or shalom? Food, feasting, and hospitality, why our view of hospitality falls far short of God's ancient calls to generosity. So those are the 10 topics, the 10 chapters that are covered in this book, and I thought it was a great list. Although I gotta say, their suggestion of more topics to cover at the end of this book made me say, we need grounded theology in the Hebrew Bible part 2. Let's get a sequel. I hope the first one sells well enough that they call for a second volume. Now, each chapter of this book was broken down into 2 sections. The first section was looking at where they looked down into the dirt, into those dig sites and the ancient writings, which of course the Bible is the primary one, to see what history can tell us about the grounded lives of those in Israel. The second half of each chapter was looking up, where they discussed how what was learned in the looking down portion can connect to their theology and view of God. The book also made a good use of illustrations and pictures throughout. This is an accessible book that should not be reserved for academia, although you certainly could use it in that context. But this is an ideal read for any Christian who is serious about understanding the context of the Old Testament world with greater clarity. My one complaint about the book is that I did find a few places where I felt like the 2 sections of the chapter, looking down, looking up, they seemed a little unconnected to me. Things that were examined and looking down, I wasn't always sure how they directly connected or impacted the looking up that followed. And so there were places where what was suggested in the subjects, what they went over, I just felt like it didn't seem to connect as well as I expected it to from each half of the chapter. The connections were there most of the time, but there were a few places where, although each of the 2 halves of the chapter were covering the same overall subject, they weren't as directly connected as I felt like they should have been, or probably I think the authors intended them to be in their writing. So here are a few examples from some of my favorite parts of the book. First, their coverage on infant mortality rates and the danger of childbirth, and how it impacted the temptation of ancient Israelites to worship idols. When you live in a world where the survival rates of newborns is 50%, and then out of those 50% who survive birth, another 35% die by the age of 5. You could imagine how those rates, how tempting it would make it for Israelites to worship a fertility god or goddess in their own household, in addition to their worship of the Lord. I think we at times belittle ancient Israel too much because we don't understand how tempting it would be to worship the gods who promised safety in childbirth when it was so dangerous in ways that it's really difficult for us to understand and comprehend in our 21st century world. It should humble us to understand and make sense as to why they would go after Baal and Asherah, who were said to govern issues of fertility. And then to see their false worship not as abandoning God from their perspective, but really as worshiping Yahweh and Asherah. And then to see also in line why the prophets had such a difficult time trying to pull them back to an exclusive worship of the Lord. I say all this not to excuse the behavior of Israel in the Old Testament, but I think this helps us understand them a little bit more. I also loved the chapter on food. I just enjoy learning what people ate in different time periods and different cultures, and I was surprised with some of the details in this book that I didn't know about from other cultural background books I've read before. And I was also challenged in that chapter at the degree of hospitality that the Lord calls upon his people, and how I probably fall far short of that call to hospitality. And so it was convicting to me that I need to be more hospitable in my interactions and my assistance given to my neighbors, which are kind of hard to get to know these days in the separation we seem to have in suburbia, where we are all so close and yet feel so far apart. I was really nervous about the chapter on war and what they might write about the Bible's narratives on war and battles, or paint the Lord of the Old Testament, which is the God of the whole Bible, but paint God in a negative light. But there was none of that in this book. They did an excellent job of putting the violence in the Old Testament in its ancient context to discuss how God used even warfare to bring about shalom or wholeness. So they really surprised me in a very good way on the chapter on war. So those are just a few examples of what I really took away from this book. But for those who want to know more about the world of the Old Testament And all wise students of the Bible should be faithful to consistently grow in their knowledge of both the ancient Israelite world and the ancient Roman Empire in order to better understand the context in which our Holy Scriptures were written. So this is a very good book. It's well presented with great resources. The format of the book itself is really well put together. They have a skillful use of charts and illustrations. The book has a great format. So students of the Bible would be wise to ground their theology in the cultural context of ancient Israel through the assistance of Elizabeth Blackfish and Cynthia Shafer-Elliott.